Hey guys, what's up? It's Johnny here, and welcome to another episode of The SIC Show. And as always, I'm super pumped to be here, and I'm here with my main man, B. How are you, my brother?
Yeah, man, I'm feeling like I'm an artist today.
This week on the show, we interview Blake Rudis, an artist turned photographer.
Yeah, and he's going to inspire us with some images, and he's going to talk about the HDR drug. And then in the create section, Blake's going to show us his workflow, the zone system, which is based on Ansel Adams' zone system. Wow. And it's how it's going to help your photography.
Awesome. And don't forget to check out our free courses. Click the link below. Grab your free course today while you still can. Let's get into it.
Enjoy.
The SIC Show. Share, inspire, create.com. Share.
All right, Blake. So share something with us that not many people know about you.
So one of the things about me, I guess it's kind of interesting, is that I grew up as a painter. I was painting with Bob Ross. I don't know if you know who Bob Ross was, at like 5 years old, and he's the Happy Trees guy, you know? So I grew up as a painter, and then I went to school for printmaking and sculpture. And while I was in school for printmaking and sculpture, I was surrounded by photographers, and they became like the legitimate bane of my existence. It was just kind of funny because it comes full circle. I'm actually more of a photographer now than anything else.
Yeah.
But it was because of this one individual in my class, and she would always say, "Well, I'm a photographer. I don't need to draw. I'm a photographer. I don't need to paint. I'm a photographer. I don't need to sculpt." And I mean, it was literally like every semester I was stuck with this girl. So finally, I just got to a point. I was like, "Look, you draw because if you can draw composition, you can photograph it, and you paint because if you can mix colors and you can understand color in your photographs, and you sculpt because if you can make something three-dimensional, then you know how to photograph something three-dimensional." And it just kind of like went right over her head, you know? So like after I graduated college, I went back into painting because I didn't have my printing presses. I was doing lithography and silk screen and etching and all these, big, heavy printing type things, old school stuff. So I'm back to painting. And then I ended up using photography as a means to photograph things that I saw in the real world to take into my painting so that I could eventually end up painting those. And then that turned into composite work in Photoshop to challenge myself with layers. And then that turned into, I wanted better photographs for my composites. So that's where the HDR stuff came in.
Awesome. So you are a true artist then. You're an artist who's taken on photography and now you're creating art through your photography. That's great.
Yeah. It's good. It's good stuff.
Inspire.
All right, Blake. So inspire us with a couple of your amazing images. I'm looking at them right now. So tell me about them.
Right. So one of the first images you're probably going to see is of the Bixby Canyon Bridge, and that's on Highway 1 in California. And that bridge in particular is it's widely shot by a lot of photographers. And even, that shot in particular, when I was taking it, there were probably 30 or 40 tourists all taking pictures of the exact same spot. But it's very difficult to shoot because, that coast, you don't always get the best images. But that was right before I started Everyday HDR. It was right before I started my blog, and right when I started to understand how to use HDR as a tool to create my images to the scope that I wanted to see. That was the very first photograph that I actually took, that when I created it, everything clicked. Everything it was right there. It was one of those things where you get that epiphany where you're stuck in this workflow kind of trap where you're not quite sure where you need to go with your photographs. And that was the first one that kind of hit me, both because I finally got that good shot of the Bixby Canyon Bridge, and also because when I was post-processing it, it spoke to me, and the whole process started to speak to me.
For those people, Blake, that don't know what HDR or high dynamic range photography is, can you explain what it is?
Yeah, it's like the drug you never want to take.
I guess. Get addicted?
Yes. I mean, look, I'm wearing an HDR rock shirt. I'm an addict of HDR. And really what it comes down to is it's, with high dynamic range, there was a mentality that high dynamic range was bracketing and taking those brackets there are 3 brackets. So you have a light picture, a dark picture, and a medium picture, and you take those into some form of processing element like Photomatix or Photoshop, and you create a 32-bit image that gets dulled down to what we can see as a 16-bit image. But really what it does is it just kind of pushes and pulls your highlights to an extent that is beyond what we think as reality. But the irony in it is that that's probably the closest you're going to get to the reality of what your eye sees. Because our eyes can see up to about 22 different stops of light, where our camera can only take 1 stop of light. So with the HDR process, you get to exploit that. But really what's happening with the HDR world now is what I like to say when I teach HDR is that if you even touch your highlights or your shadows sliders, you are incurring a heightened dynamic range in your photograph.
So like in Lightroom, if you're adjusting the sliders for shadows and highlights,
Exactly, because what you're doing there is you're taking the information from a single file and you're exploiting the excess information that's there in your highlights and your shadows. So ultimately, you are heightening the dynamic range of that photograph.
Awesome.
So traditionally, what people think of HDR and why it gets such a bad name is because if you Google it, you're going to find some really nasty stuff. But if you really boil down what the term HDR is and what you actually get from the process, most photographers are probably working in the realm of HDR right now and don't even realize it.
Okay, so awesome. So back to this image. So this is the first image you took where you saw the potential of using HDR to post-process this image so that it looked more real than your camera actually showed you on the back of the screen, because I see there's a lot of cloud cover. Maybe it was a bit of a gray day. There are some sunny areas, but there's also some darker areas. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Right. And that's one of those areas where when the cloud cover rolls in, it comes in and it's very thick and it's very heavy. And when you see that depth in that image from the foreground to the background, it's really hard. It's almost impossible to capture it in one photograph. So that was kind of where I saw the reality for the HDR stuff, and it really hit me the most, and it made the most impact. And, if you look at some of the past stuff in Everyday HDR, and when I advertise Everyday HDR, it's always that picture, because that's the picture that spoke to me the most. But you can't really capture that range of cloud coverage without something being blown out in that instance. Whereas with the HDR stuff, you can keep it all kind of at bay.
Awesome. Good. So the next image I got from you is looks like a cascade or a waterfall coming down. Is that the one we're looking at?
Right. Yes. And that's an interesting one, because it does have like that was taken in the Blue Mountains of Georgia. Okay. And really that one speaks to me too, because I was actually filming the intro to Exploring HDR, the video series. My wife was doing the filming of me shooting that. And that's one of those images where you're on scene and you just know that out of the whole day, you're not going to process any other photograph but that one. That's the one. That's the one. The minute you get home, you're like, yes, this is the one. I don't need to look at the rest of them. This is the one that I'm going to put the most work and the most time and the most effort into. But it's also one of those things that even after being a photographer for upwards of, a little over 16 years, and even an artist for, I don't even know how long, there's still a surprise to me, and there's still a shock to me that even in this world with that much experience, there's nothing that's predictable. With that photograph, I had this idea in my head of how that was going to turn out.
Yeah.
And then in the processing of it, it turned out better. And that's just the thing that for all these aspiring photographers that are, coming up in the world, is that, you're never going to master this. And that's a good thing. You should never want to master it, because if you master it, you're going to get bored.
Yeah.
So with that photograph, it's like I was on the scene. I felt that it was going to be the good shot of the day. But then as I was post-processing it, and I was blending an HDR process with a long exposure process. So that's actually about 4 total images that are all kind of put together into one. But in that process of experimentation and saying, okay, well, what happens if I mix this HDR with this long exposure stuff? What's going to happen? I didn't know yet. So as I was experimenting with it, it all kind of came to fruition, and it really, that's the surprise element. Like, it doesn't matter how long you think you've been doing this or what you think you still don't know anything when it really boils down to it.
Yeah, man, I love it. And I love the fall colors back there too. So you got the cooler colors in the foreground, the water, and then it goes to the warmer colors in the background. Lovely. And we'll jump into the last image you sent me, and it looks like I'm looking up at a tree into the lights. And now this is definitely where HDR really kicks in, because you basically you're looking at, well, if you had to look at this, photograph this with a normal camera or just on auto, it would be a silhouette, right?
More than likely, yes. And that one's interesting because I took that in 2012. It was on a photo walk that I was doing for Scott Kelby's Worldwide Photo Walk. I was hosting the photo walk here in Weston in Missouri. And that tree is only about 6 feet tall. Okay. But it looks huge, and it looks epic, and it looks monumental. And, when I look at my photographs and I say, okay, which one is the one that speaks to me the most? It's that photograph, because at that time I hadn't written any books yet. I hadn't had any educational material besides my blog that I started in 2010. So we're looking at about 2 years span of just really working really hard to get to that point. And when I looked up at that tree, it was kind of like, yeah, this tree's only 6 feet tall, but I made it look huge and epic. And, especially with the artistic effects, with the light rays blowing through, and just that glimmer of hope, that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's kind of all wrapped into one with that photograph. I wasn't quite where I wanted to be, but I knew I wanted to be bigger. And I think that it doesn't matter what you do, whether you're a photographer, you're an architect, or anything. You're always trying to one up yourself. You're always trying to get to the top of that tree. And even if you start out as a 6 foot tall tree, you have these ideas in your head that you're going to be a 12, 15, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 foot tall tree. But by the time you get to that point, you're still kind of at the same point that you were in the beginning. You're still trying to one up yourself. Yeah. And that's the photograph that, a lot of times with me, when I'm done with the photograph, I'm done. I process it, I educate on it, and I'm done. But I've probably printed that photograph 15 different times, once on canvas, on metal, on metallic paper. It's right here in my office, right next to me at all times. So when I get into those doldrums, there's no wind in my sails. I look over at that picture. I'm like, you know what? That's where you were in 2012, and look where you're coming, and look where you're going. And I always have a 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan. And my goal in that 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan is to always one up that 1 year plan, so that by the time the 5 year plan happens, I've already developed another 5 year plan. And awesome. I think that's kind of what that tree speaks to me about, is that there's never an end to it. And that no matter where you are in your career, where you are in your mindset, there's always something bigger for you.
Totally. And I think that's a really good metaphor for the journey us photographers go through, and especially if you're actually running a business that involves photography. I don't actually know how you can do a 1 or 5 year forecast. I do a 12-week forecast. And even that's difficult for me.
Right.
When it comes to goal setting and that type of thing. So awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. How did you get those rays of sun, light rays coming through the tree like that? What did you do?
What I did with that was I took, I selected for the highlights in Photoshop, and I made a copy of the highlight layer. And then I took a radial blur and blew it out with the zoom. I actually have a video on that on my YouTube channel, so that if you want to check that out, it's there. Right, yeah. But yeah, and then if you just select the highlights, it won't blow anything else out. But then you can also put some protections in place for your midtones and your shadows, so it actually looks like a natural blowout. But in reality, if you were to see the original photograph of that, there was no highlight rays blowing out whatsoever.
Okay, awesome, good. Well, thanks for inspiring us with those, Blake. They're amazing, awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Create.
Tell me a little bit more about the zone system that you're talking about.
Sure. So it was in about 2013. I was getting back into some of my high school reading. I picked up Ansel Adams' books, The Camera, The Negative, and The Print. And if you've never read any of those books, they were written in the 80s by Ansel Adams, and they still ring true today to good photography. If you want to make the best of the best, this is the place to start. Because, and actually you probably get your whole education just from Ansel Adams from the 80s on analog film, even in the digital world. So what I did was I wanted to not recreate the wheel for workflow. I wanted to create a workflow that would work for us in Photoshop, just like what Ansel Adams had created in Camera and what he further created in the Print. And so what I did was I took the concept of the zone system and built a 0 to 10 scale zone system. So when you press play on this action, it breaks your photograph into all of the 11 zones from 0 to zone 10 on that 0 to 255 spread. But it organically selects those zones. It's not like luminosity masking. I don't want people to confuse it with luminosity masking because it's not selecting the luminance values. It's selecting the individual colors for 0 through zone 10. And it allows you to modify a curves layer within zone 0 through zone 10. So the idea is you get your tone right first. So my workflow is I open up a pretty basic HDR image that has no stylization to it whatsoever. I bring it into Photoshop, press play. I get my 10 zones for the tone. I really get into the tone to make sure that all of my tones are set correctly. And then there's the color zone system after that. So then after that's run, I'm not just working on a black and white photograph, I'm working on a color photograph for tone. I'll press play on the color zone system action. It does the same thing for all of your colors. So you get red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, and then you can get some of the tertiary colors in there like orange, so that you can modify those colors in between. And that really kind of evolved. At first, it was color to try and mix color like a painter on a palette. But as I've started to develop, the color zone system also works for tone also. So even though you get your tones right over your 0 through 10, now you have your colors. It's a very, what I call a layer intensive process, but not a labor intensive process. It sounds like a lot, but when it comes down to it, I like to consider myself a workflow efficiency expert at this point. If I see something in my workflow that's not working, that's taking too long, I throw it out. And I've been doing that for a long period of time. So I've incorporated a workflow over the course of 6 or 7 years that just has been failing over and over and over again. And you throw those pieces out until you get the efficient workflow that works. So some of these images that I'm creating now used to take me 3, 4, 5 hours to create. Now they're taking me anywhere from 7 to 20 minutes to create, just because I've nailed it down to getting the photo technically perfect with tone, getting it technically perfect with color, and then I move into the artistic realm.
Awesome. So what does that mean for someone who actually wants to use your zone system and they photograph something as an HDR image? What does it mean to them? How will it help them?
How will it help them? It's basically it's a workflow kind of guideline essentially. So what happened to me when I first started was I would jump into Photoshop with a photo and I might make a curves adjustment layer. I might make a levels adjustment layer. But what I was really doing was I was throwing darts in the dark. It's like you have no idea what you're doing when you're getting into Photoshop unless you really boil it down into a workflow that works. So it's basically taking the tried and true tested stuff over the course of time that many artists have been putting together, putting it all into one. So you work on your photograph like a photographer with tone, and you work on your photograph like a painter with color. And once you're done with those two systems, you have a complete and finished final product. So you're exploiting the dynamic range that's in there. And that's the thing is that I like to talk about the workflow process as almost like an interrogation. The information is in the file. Yeah. It's in there. You got to get it out of there somehow. And these techniques are like the waterboarding of of interrogation on an image. It's like, yeah, and why I use the HDR process is because you can get a lot more out of a 16-bit TIFF than you can out of a 14-bit single exposure.
Yeah.
So it really helps to use that exploited workflow.
Awesome. Well, I hope this workflow is actually vetted by the Geneva Convention and not like the waterboarding. So, awesome.
Yeah,
Well, Blake,
it's just an
thank you.
analogy, you know.
Yeah, no. Well, thanks. I actually can't wait to jump in and have a look at your zone system. I know you're going to give me access soon. So, anyone who wants to, we'll have the links below the show. So jump in and check out Blake's zone system. Thanks for being on the show, Blake. Really enjoyed, your share, your, how you the artist, the photographer, or the artist who became a photographer, and using the art in your photography. Those 3 images you inspired us with, amazing. And then this video. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm actually honored to be here. So I really thank you for inviting me on.
No worries. And we'll leave all the links around the show above or below. Awesome.
Nice.
Thanks.
Sounds good.
Oh, that was an interesting interview, brother.
Yeah.
Man, that zone system he's got for HDR, it's pretty cool, man.
Yeah, it's
really
like an
interesting.
artist take on photography, and I kind of like that. So you actually basically, he's come from an artist background, and that's what I like about it. It's basically photo art.
Yeah, which is all good, man. I see photography as an art for me, man.
Yeah, totally.
I love it, mate.
Yeah.
Cool, guys. Another epic show. Don't forget to check out our free courses. Click the link below. They're absolutely epic. And we'll see you again next week.
Awesome. And make sure you click on the link above or below to check out Blake's zone system.
Yeah, for sure, man. Check it out, guys.
Awesome.
It's awesome.
See you guys
Take
next
care.
week.
Bye.
To find out more, go to shareinspirecreate.com.